This is Robert Gleeman with EMR Update. We're talking today with Mark Anderson from the A.C.Group. Mark Anderson's phone number, in case you want to give him a call, is 1-281-413-5572. Thanks for being with us again today, Mark.
Thank you for having me come and speak again.
Our subject today is 5 things to do with your old paper medical records, and I assume that burning in a public bonfire is not one of them. Is that true?
That is one of the options, but not one that we would recommend doing.
Well, why don't we go through these one by one, and if you would, let's start out with number 1.
Well, if you look at most practices, I think the average doctor has around 5,000 active charts. And what the vendors usually recommend, option 1, is just scan everything in. It's amazing where a lot of the vendors are telling people that you have all this medical records information, and one of the ways of reducing cost is to get rid of your chart room. And some doctors have actually gone back in and taken all their old charts, pulled them out, and actually scan them directly in as a PDF file into the EMR. The vendors recommend it, but once you go back and look at the cost, taking all those charts, scanning them all in, and storing it in your EMR, there's a heavy cost for the labor to scan every one of those documents in. Yes, you do free up that space, but if you're not going to use that space for revenue-producing new activities, there's a lot of cost added in. So a lot of doctors think about scanning everything in. Then they come back in and say, there must be a better option. Maybe I can just scan parts of the information in.
And does that lead us to number 2?
Yes. I think one that does make a little bit more sense is a partial scanning of your paper charts. And a couple things to remember. When you scan the document in, there is no data. You're basically looking at a piece of paper. So if you wanted to go back and say, give me all the patients that are on a certain medication or have a certain lab result, you're not going to have that by scanning the information in. So what most practices are doing, and this is one of the options that are out there under option 2, is that they're going in and saying, any new patient that I have coming in today or in the next week, based on the appointment schedule, I'm going to have a clerk pull that chart like they normally would do. Then they go in and either scan the whole chart in based on that appointment, or they will decide, based on the specialty, what pieces of information are important to my practice. And a lot of times the doctors will say, give me the last 3 lab results, the last 3 office visit notes, and any other procedure or invasive procedure that may go on, and have that brought in as a scanned-in document.
And in this second scenario, what percentage of the charts would typically be scanned?
Obviously, it always depends on the specialty. If you go back and look at a typical family practice physician, there's a lot more of that chart that they want to have, they classify as clinically important. So in that case, you may see 40 or 50% of the chart may be scanned in. If you go back to another specialist, maybe a dermatologist, or let's call it an orthopedic surgeon, you may only want to be scanning in relative information that's taking care of the current injury that you're taking care of the patient for.
This leads us to scenario number 3.
Well, I think when you start looking at scenario number 3, it's really going back and saying, can you find a way of summarizing the chart in what a lot of doctors are calling a patient summary page? And that typical patient summary page is a 1 or 2 page document that's usually on the very front of the chart that has on it information about the diagnosis of the patient, what labs that they've had, what medications that they're currently on. Then maybe you just scan in that 1 piece of paper or 2 pieces of paper about the patient. The value there is maybe the patient doesn't have an appointment to come in yet, but they call up about a medication refill. With your typical EMR, until that patient's been seen, there's no data in the computer system at all. But in this case, if a patient's calling in and you scan in that 1 or 2 pages that summarizes everything about the patient, the doctor can then pull up, see who the patient is, find out what active meds they're on and when's the last time they've been seen. Enough information where they can actually help the patient without having to tell the patient to call back later or have somebody run and go find the chart every single time. We have found by having a summary page, you can cut out about 80% of the chart pulls that are necessary. Again, assuming the doctors establish what they call as clinically important information and have that kind of summarized in a handwriting form on the actual chart to start with. Because remember, you can always go back in, if it's a very active patient with multiple diagnosis issues, you can always go back in and scan more pages in or the whole chart in if you want. This is probably where the highest level of adoption is, where the doctor has a summary sheet, and then maybe they actually will highlight maybe the last 3 lab reports you also want to have scanned in. What you're doing is really limiting the amount of scanning that you want to do on active patients by having a 1 sheet or 2 sheets that really summarizes, and then maybe 2 or 3 pieces of paper that are clinically important that you really can't put on a summary sheet. And we're seeing about 80% of the doctors are embracing that kind of technology right now.
Interesting.
Option 4 is where the doctor sees the patient with the paper chart today. They see the patient, they put new things into the EMR, and then what they do is they go back to the old note, and they may put a little sticky note on that chart stating that these are clinically important things I need to have pulled and scanned in after the visit. They may go in and circle things on the chart, specific data elements that they want maybe their nurse or a clerical person to enter in as discrete data. So we think option 4 is probably the best way to do it today.
And there is an option 5. What is that?
Option 5 is an interesting approach because most doctors today are very busy in their practices and their staff don't have a lot of extra time to scan charts in. Option 5 deals with hiring an outside firm that can come in, and they really do 2 things. One is they review the chart, and they can scan pieces of paper in for you. But a lot of these companies also can go through, review the chart, and do a lot of your data entry for you. So they can actually be your interim nurse or MA who goes through, reviews all your active charts. Maybe patients are coming in the next week. And they spend the time scanning the documents in and putting in discrete data into the EMR. Of course, there's a cost applied to that. But in most practices, again, we find they do not have enough time to do their normal work, learn how to use the EMR, and scan the documents in, especially during that first 6 months.
At what point can you actually get rid of the paper files and destroy them?
Well, we always say you should always check your state because each state has a little different requirements. But traditionally, everybody looks at you have to keep any patient that has been active in your practice for 7 years over and above the age of 21. So anybody that's been in your practice, maybe they were seen when they were 5 years old, you have to keep that chart active until they're 21.
Mark, of the 5 options you've mentioned, which is the most cost-effective?
I think the most cost-effective method right now is what we talked about as far as option 4, the one where the practice sees the patient with the paper chart, records what's important for them, maybe puts a sticky note on the documents that they really need, and then the staff basically, instead of refiling that chart later on, they basically take that chart, scan in the specific data that's important, and you may file it off-site because you won't need it again for a while. That way the staff, instead of spending the time refiling the chart, is basically scanning it in. So there isn't a lot of additional cost for doing it that way. We think that's the most effective way of handling the old paper records today.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Mark Anderson, A.C. Group. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.